I'm really excited to be with you tonight. I really appreciate that you took the time out of what I'm sure are busy schedules for everyone to be here. And I wish I could see all of your faces. That's my favorite presentation style, actually being able to to talk to people. I can see their eyes, but this will work. That's what technology is for. And I don't know how many people are familiar with my work, so I'm going to try to kind of go through those that maybe don't know anything at all, but then hopefully give some material for maybe people who have read the books. If you've read the books or have heard us speak before and you have follow-up questions or something that's on your mind, definitely feel free to chat and hopefully we can get those covered. But for those who do not know who I am, my name is Stoddard, and I am the director of the Joseph Smith Foundation, carrying that on after my father passed away from cancer last year. But the focus of the Joseph Smith Foundation is really to help equip people with real history, to help show them that actually history, data, the science actually backs up our faith, backs up the prophet Joseph Smith, backs up the Book of Mormon, and that you can actually get into the nitty-gritty details of church history, and your faith and your testimony can actually come away stronger, not because you just believe in some intangible faith, this feeling or emotion out there, but actually that the data, the facts fortify faith. And we go into so many of the tough issues. We go into seer stones, translation of the Book of Mormon, polygamy, like you name it, we go in there and we tackle it. And so we wrote these two books, the Faith Crisis series, Faith Crisis Volume 1, We Were Not Betrayed, and Faith Crisis Volume 2, Behind Closed Doors, a few years ago. And what kind of spurred that on is, we've been doing a lot of research over the years. We did stuff on Joseph Smith and Freemasonry and the Book of Mormon and all these different topics. So we would go around and we started doing firesides and presentations, helping people with faith crisis, or helping parents or someone who has a loved one who's struggling with kind of the church history niche, to kind of walk through these issues. So they'd be like, whoa, what am I hitting with race and Adam God and this stuff, and kind of like help people walk through that history. And as we were walking through this, we kept discovering that so many people were getting hit against this new narrative. Basically, that maybe it wasn't so much the history that they were struggling with as much as it was, wait, I grew up being told with one version of story. Why am I getting told another? And so we wrote these books to kind of dive into that question, helping people to wrestle with the two narratives, so then people can be empowered to walk away and make their own decision really where they stand. And so I'm going to go a little bit fast tonight. So got 40 minutes, we're like 37 now. And so don't panic if I skip through some things. I put a lot of material in here when I was preparing because I wasn't sure like how it would go, and I knew people would be probably asking questions. So I wanted to be able to have material at my fingertips to be able to kind of jump around. I think there is somebody with a mic on. I don't know if the panelists are on that, but I can hear a background conversation through my mic with my earpiece here. So I don't know if someone can look at that, but as I was saying, so I have a lot of material. We're going to go into that. But
that's the first time I did.
1 second. Let me just, sorry, it's a little bit loud on my end.
Dean, can you mute, please? Dean, can you mute?
There you go. Sorry. I'll get better at listening to a conversation and talking at the same time here. So as I was saying, kind of going in through tackling, okay, what are these narratives? So going to go fast. There's a lot of material. So if you see something and you panic and you're like, no, wait, I wanted to see that slide. Everything is in the books. You can get them through Kindles. You can get them through books. We have the first half of the audiobook of Volume 1 is done. It's out there. It's on Audible even. And other audiobook pieces are coming. So don't panic. If there's a question, something you hit, then just tell me and we can direct you where to find all that information. So do you know someone who's struggling with faith crisis? You probably do, or maybe have hit some questions yourself. Over the years, last several years, we've seen just different statistics. There's some people that are really optimistic about numbers and how people are doing with their testimony, but then there's some other statistics that start coming out that don't look so good. And I think the biggest thing that people have been noticing is with the millennials, that many of the millennials are struggling. And so there was a lady named Jana Reese. She did the Next Mormon survey, and she was talking about, why are so many millennials leaving the church and struggling and losing their testimony? And she said, we used to keep and retain about 75%, but for the millennial group, that was going down to 46. So what is it? And people have debated and discussed this, is it the translation of the Book of Mormon? Is it this or that church history thing? Is it sin problems? Is it getting offended? Like, what is it? And she found that one of the primary reasons that people were struggling and really abandoning their testimony in Joseph Smith, abandoning the Book of Mormon, was this trust gap. So it wasn't so much the history itself. It was this feeling of, wait a minute, I'm hearing now that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon with a seer stone. I was never told that. I was told the opposite. I was told the Urim and Thummim narrative. What is this? Hitting hard issues with Joseph Smith and polygamy. And as they were hitting not just history they hadn't heard of before, but actually a new narrative that we're going to talk a little bit about, a narrative that says, well, yeah, we kind of whitewashed and portrayed this beautiful picture of Joseph Smith, this praise to the man, the Joseph Smith in the movies, but the truth is he wasn't quite that stellar of a guy. And we kind of need to accept his warts and move on from there. That's a struggle for a lot of people. And they're feeling this trust gap, this feeling of, I was betrayed, I was lied to, why wasn't I told the whole story? As Jana Reese said, she said that they're telling her, I don't trust to tell the truth about controversial issues. There was one lady who said, I was sold this, it's this beautiful story. And she's like, it's full of lies. And it's not because I wanted an excuse to leave. It's because I'm feeling betrayed. And one of the first things that I like to often tell people, because so many people come to me and say, well, if they had just had a testimony, or if they were just living better, then the doubts wouldn't come. And I want to say, okay, we have two narratives that are being really told, that are really being battled over right now. On the one side, there's this side of, like I was mentioning, we have Joseph Smith, and he was a man of character. And then we have this new version of Joseph Smith that's being told in books like Rough Stone Rolling and other accounts. That's this not so great of a picture. Now, if we have lied about who Joseph Smith really was, if we did manipulate our history, if we have not been honest about the facts, right? Really the substance, the foundation, like, okay, we can make mistakes and we can learn new things about little details. We can correct things. We can dive into the Mountain Meadows Massacre and uncover more. But if the basis, the foundation, if the substance of our history is false, and if we lied and whitewashed Joseph Smith's character, and Joseph Smith really was a treasure-seeking, vengeful, arrogant, prideful man like is portrayed in Rough Stone Rolling, I'm going to be the first person to say I would be out too, because I would say, no, you can't do that. And that was an experience. There was a lady named Crystal Johnson, and she tells her story on YouTube. She's a faithful member. She comes from parents who are mission presidents. They're going on all of these missions. She's full in, right? And she hits Rough Stone Rolling, and she hits another book, a biography on Emma Smith, and she is shattered. She's like, I was never told this history growing up. And it was especially the translation of the Book of Mormon that hit her, because in Rough Stone Rolling, it says that, you know what, the story that we told about Joseph Smith using the plates and using the Urim and Thummim is actually not true. He actually used this black chocolate colored seer stone, a seer stone that he had actually used in treasure digging in his past. And that's what he used to translate the Book of Mormon. And she hit that and she said, wait a minute, I swore growing up I had a testimony of the Urim and Thummim, and now I'm getting a new history. And she talked to historians. She talked to people who were members of the church, and they said, yeah, we didn't really tell the true story because the truth is a little kooky. And she's like, that's not okay. You can't lie to people. And I understand where Crystal is coming from 100%. And I would say, absolutely, she has a point. So let's just take the translation of the Book of Mormon for a moment. With the Joseph Smith Foundation and a team of researchers, we did serious in-depth research on the translation of the Book of Mormon. Russ, who's going to be presenting here in about 45 minutes, he was one of the editors on that book. So many other people helped. And what we've discovered is there are no eyewitness statements supporting the claim that Joseph Smith used a seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon. And we go through, for example, people say, but what about David Whitmer? We go through David Whitmer. We actually go into really the origin, where the seer stone narrative came from. And we've discovered that all the seer stone and hat translation statements, they come from apostates, they come from anti-Mormon sources, and the eyewitnesses state that the translation of the Book of Mormon occurred using only the Urim and Thummim and the plates. And not only do we go into that, but we go into, well, why does it matter? Actually, there are doctrinal implications. People say, well, it doesn't really matter how he did it. It actually does matter. So we go into that, we publish that book, Seer Stone v. Urim and Thummim. But when I hear stories like Crystal Johnson and others, it breaks my heart, because I'm like, you just got a different version of history. And if you had only known or had someone there to show you another side, the outcome could have been so different. She ended up leaving the church. She's out. She left. So the struggle is happening over history. Now, I've alluded to the book Rough Stone Rolling a few times. We've done work with the Joseph Smith Foundation debunking. We have more material coming out in the future. This may be a book that you have heard about or someone you know has read. This book is one of the primary driving forces causing members to struggle with their testimony. So many people say, no, it's helping, it's helping. And I like to just bring up, okay, let's go to, this is the Old Mormon Stories website. I believe they've updated it now, but in the past, they had a big banner with all of these different profiles and of different scholars. So for those who don't know, Mormon Stories is run by John Dehlin. He is a critic of the church. He definitely has a different perspective than someone like myself. And so who does he have listed on his website is go read these books, go listen to this or that scholar. Well, right there on his homepage, he has Richard Bushman right there alongside Jeremy Runnels, who authored the CES letter, and other individuals. So, and not only that, but this is a screenshot from one of his very popular interviews with a family that left the church. And you can see right in the backdrop, he's got Rough Stone Rolling right there next to Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. Now, Rough Stone Rolling is, like I mentioned, it's considered a authoritative biography on Joseph Smith, but it was written by Richard Bushman, and it really encapsulates what this new narrative, this new interpretation of church history is and where it's going, especially when it comes to Joseph Smith. And that is what I want to go into just a little bit today, give you guys kind of maybe a jump start into a little bit of history. It's why we wrote the two Faith Crisis books, because we wanted to go into this question. We wanted to go into, why are there two different stories? Why is our history changing? Where's the new history coming from? And of course, the most important question, which narrative is true? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it changes. What matters is what is true. We need to not be afraid of facts. We need to not be afraid of where the evidence leads. but we need to make sure that if we're changing our history, are we changing to something that is accurate? And so to lay some foundation, just to make sure we're all on the same page, you have to understand that there's this thing that some scholars call the dominant narrative. This is a term that Richard Bushman has used himself. And the dominant narrative was the really narrative that was promoted by the church for nearly 200 years, right? And it says, Joseph Smith was the greatest prophet ever to live, second to Jesus Christ. He wasn't just this guy who had some great ideas. He is the prophet set apart to bring forward the marvelous work and a wonder. He was the greatest man in character next to Jesus Christ. And that the revelations he gave, Joseph Smith, he said, there is no error in the revelations I have taught. He said, I never told you I was perfect, but there are no errors in the revelations. And that's what was believed. The Book of Mormon is the most correct book. It's historical. It is accurate doctrinally. It's not just, we can go pick and choose a few pieces that we like. It's not a buffet. This is the most correct book. And the events of the restoration were truthfully recorded. The history recorded by Wilford Woodruff, it's accurate. And it literally occurred. The priesthood was given by literal angels that came. The temple endowment was a restoration of truths that came from hundreds of years ago, not hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, right? Since the days of Adam, it was a restoration of all things. So here we have this dominant narrative. Now, for someone like Richard Bushman, he says, we have to reconstruct this narrative. It's not true. It can't be sustained. He says, we've got to change it. And he's like, it's going to be really hard for people, especially older people. And he says, we have to change.
Can I jump in for a second? You're doing great. I love your enthusiasm, and I was about ready to stand up and sing "Praise to the Man." That's fun. When you're comparing, and I'm in your camp, right? So there's no attack here.
No, you're good.
Let me figure it out. When you're talking about comparisons of truth, one of the references I'm familiar with is a book called "The Words of Joseph Smith and Nauvoo Discourses."
Yes, by Andrew E. Hatt.
Yeah, and I remember talking with I think it was Cook. I think E. Hasanori in Utah and Cook is in Arizona. And he was saying that there was lots of stuff that they felt was really great, but they couldn't include it in their book because they had a standard. And their standard was, I'm not trying to promote their book, although I like it. Do you like it? Is that
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Let's promote the book.
Yes.
All right.
I'm waiting for him to get the republished for the new edition out. Been waiting.
But what they said was that they wanted, and this is my recollection, so don't quote me in, but my sense was that they only used things, their version of truth, right? Way of discerning truth was something that was written by someone who heard it directly, contemporaneously, not 40 years later, and by someone who at the time they wrote it was not an enemy of the church, right? And so I'm curious about, as you're talking about the standard of truth, do you have that kind of a matrix that you apply to say this is the correct story, this is not the correct story, and would you mind sharing what that might be? Okay,
that is an awesome question. That's a 1-hour discussion in and of itself. So let me just try to give a little bit here. You mentioned something, and okay, let me start back just a little bit. So what we go into in the Faith Crisis books is helping people understand that these really, there's so many different interpretations of history, right? But right now, the big battle, if you had to kind of like simplify it down a little bit, is you've got a progressive viewpoint and you've got a traditionalist viewpoint. And if I can, I'm going to get to your question. I'm just going to lay some groundwork here. If you go to actually what's happened in American history, it's actually very similar. And this may be something that people may be able to relate to and understand. So we had, through the 1900s, we had a lot of secular scholars who rewrote American history to create a what is often called a revisionist history. So that's the term that's kind of used often when discussing the changes in American history, right? This is where we get the founding fathers were deists, pulling out a lot of the miracles. Thomas Jefferson had an affair with Sally Hemings, Benjamin Franklin, a womanizer. We really saw this rewriting of American history, of course, to lead to the goal was to actually change policy. And the same thing happened and is happening with Latter-day Saint history. And a lot of people don't realize that. In fact, it's some of the same players. So I mentioned a minute ago that John DeLynn had Rough Stone Rolling right there next to Von Brody's No Man Knows My History. Von Brody wrote No Man Knows My History. It's definitely a complete rewriting of Joseph Smith's life. She was excommunicated, and she later went to Thomas Jefferson. She was the one that really began pushing and documented down the claim that Thomas Jefferson had an affair with Sally Hemings. And so it's just fascinating to me. So often, sometimes you actually see a parallel. You see people that are involved in the rewriting of Latter-day Saint history are also involved in this rewriting of American history, that there's this movement. And what you discover when you actually get into the progressive rewriting of Latter-day Saint history is that there is a desire to change policies, doctrines. There's a different understanding of what is and is not valid when it comes to scripture. Different past doctrines, current doctrines are understanding. And where I'm going with that is to come to your question. Okay, yes. So what is that standard of truth when we're interpreting history? So it depends on if you're kind of come at it from a progressive standpoint versus a traditionalist standpoint. So for example, you mentioned what sources we take as credible. And I'm going to skip ahead here because I actually have a slide on this, but it's at the end, but I want to use it here as we're talking about this. From a progressive standpoint, they're really big on this idea of all sources go. So what that means is basically it doesn't matter really the standpoint or where the person was coming from, the perspective, or really kind of their credibility. All of the sources need to be accepted because there is no such thing really as like solid truth, right? So we would say, traditionalists are going to say, okay, there is no error in the revelations that Joseph Smith taught. The Book of Mormon is the most correct book. You can go to the standard works. You can rely on scripture. It is a firm foundation. Use scripture and use scriptural principles to help discern what is truth. Is someone lying? Is someone telling the truth? Is there perspective that there is such a thing as a true perspective coming from God? Versus more of a progressive is going to say, no, there isn't. So let's take the Book of Mormon, for example. There's a huge movement going on right now to say that the Book of Mormon is biased history because Mormon was a war general. Mormon had his own perspective on life. And so he's going to go through the Book of Mormon and kind of give maybe warped, maybe not warped, but definitely his version of the history. If we have Layman and Lemuel's version of the history, it'd be a lot different. We only have Nephi's. So can we really say that the Book of Mormon is true? No, we need more sources because we only have one person's perspective. Or you can say, well, actually, the only perspective that really is valid is God's. And it is possible to know what God's perspective on history is. And that is what Nephi attempted to do. Nephi sits down and he says, this record is true. What I'm about to tell you is what really happened. So this is a statement from Richard Bushman. Hopefully I'm explaining that correctly. If there's any confusion, we can kind of clarify it. But Richard Bushman makes this comment talking about kind of the sources that Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging. And he talked about how the traditionalist response before his time was to say, okay, all of these stories that Joseph Smith was a money digger, that he was involved in ritual magic, that his family was involved in ritual magic, those were fabrications from Joseph Smith's enemies. Richard Bushman comes on the scene and says, no. So for example, Dr. Philasus Hurlbut, he goes and he was an excommunicated member of the church. He was actually excommunicated from 3 denominations for issues with immorality. He gets excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ with Joseph Smith, and he's so angry, he swears that he will drink Joseph Smith's blood. So he actually gets paid by a committee to go back east and gather up affidavits, digging up any dirt he can on the Smith family. He comes back before he can get his affidavits published. He actually gets called up in court for threatening Joseph Smith's life. And then he does get cited for that, found guilty. And meanwhile, his wife, it comes out, had an affair with one of the Baptists, a minister, a friend of his. And so basically his character was ruined. He could not publish this material. So he sells it all to E.D. Howe, who himself had an interest. He had a family member who was a member of the church, but he was against the church. So they publish Mormonism Unveiled. And it's all of these accounts of people who hated Joseph Smith, who some of them were actually involved in magic and the occult themselves. So from different traditionalist historians in the past, like Joseph Fielding Smith, looked at that and said, you can't trust Hurlbut. You cannot trust some of these other men like Willard Chase. Richard Bushman comes on the scene and says, no, you have to. So he says, the first thing I said is you can't dismiss all these affidavits with the wave of a hand. Academic historians take them seriously. So should I. I want to use just an example to kind of bring this home. Is this the right approach to history? If we were in the New Testament era and we wanted to find out the truth of Jesus Christ, is Judas Iscariot's perspective going to be equal in truth? Is he going to be able to tell us reality, how things really happened, the same as Peter? What about Herod? What about Pilate? What about Caiaphas? If we get Caiaphas up, right? Peter, James and John, Paul, Mary Magdalene, they're going to give one account. This is who Jesus Christ was. This was his character. This is what he taught. This was his motivations. This was how he lived in his private life. They're going to tell one version. If we went and called Caiaphas up, he would have a completely different story. So would Herod. So would Judas Iscariot. So from a progressive perspective, Caiaphas is going to have just as much of a right. He's going to be just as credible as Peter. From a traditionalist perspective, you're going to say, no, there's this thing called truth. There's this thing called God. There's this guy called God. And he is, there is such a thing. It's not just different people's perspectives. And Caiaphas is lying. He has an agenda. He has a motivation. He's not inspired with the right spirit. Peter's version captures truth. So I don't know if that helps answer the question a little bit. I mean, there's so much we could go into. That's just one area, like on sources, but it really comes down to this: how do progressives see it and how do traditionals see it? So it's not so much about history all the time as it is about worldview and perspective.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful. Somebody has asked a question, and I'm not sure how you want to address it. And you can say pass if you want, but
Sure.
There is this movement going on that's kind of trying to discredit Brigham. And so she says, curious on your opinion on Brigham Young stuff, evidence that he changed the things to make him, that kind of stuff, right? So, can you walk lightly and address that?
No, I'll give you the 10-second version since I don't have a presentation on that, but I do not believe that movement is credible. I think it can be debunked and discredited through data, through facts, and through also just different areas of logic and reason.
Perfect. Thank you. Another thing that we're at about 10 minutes to go. So we might have a little bit of conversationally here. One of the things that I've noticed is not only has the doctrine been modified over time, right?
Right.
So the history has been modified. The modification of history has pushed doctrinal changes. But I'm kind of more of the spiritual camp. The need for necessary spiritual experiences, baptism of fire, etc. And speaking in tongues and healing the sick and such. And that seems to have also been a victim. The whole faith. But the power in the Holy Ghost and faith to accomplish the miraculous, as we see in Acts chapter 2, and seem to be very active during the original years of the church, is almost gone. And do you agree with that? And would you say that that's kind of a victim of the same revisionist history?
Yes, and I can actually give you an example. That's a really good question. So there is a book by Todd Compton. He is a progressive scholar. and it's called In Sacred Loneliness. And he wrote it on biographies of all of the plural wives of Joseph Smith, at least the known documented ones at the time. So he goes through and he does kind of a short biography on each of the women. And to give you an idea, again, so this is where it comes in perfectly, where you've got, okay, what's their perspective, right? So he takes Eliza Snow. Eliza Snow was someone who spoke in tongues. Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, she believed that one of the three Nephites came and visited her, different spiritual experiences. Well, when Todd Compton is writing about this, he talks about it as, yeah, this was part of the Mormon psychic environment. One of the wives that talks about this understanding of God promising and saying, hey, you know, the mobbers and the people that persecuted you, divine justice will come. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. And he says, yeah, that was just part of this, you know, kind of judgmental, this early Mormonism, right? There's early Mormonism, and then we come to today. And in the early Mormonism, it was this psychological thing where people believed in visions and they believed in dreams and they believed in these speaking in the gifts of tongues. And nowadays we look at that and we're like, okay, these women are a little crazy. Right. So that's going to be how they interpret it. Helen Mar Kimball is a great example. So I just finished a biography of Helen Mar Kimball. So she's the infamous 14-year-old that everyone talks about with Joseph Smith. And so we decided to tackle the whole question of Joseph Smith and polygamy. And instead of everyone goes right into the plural marriage aspect, like let's go debate the doctrine. And we said, we want to take a different approach. We want to actually go to the women and just let their voices be heard. Set everyone aside, put them into the background. What did they think about it? What did they feel? And not only that, but what were their stories? These were real people. These were real women with personalities, with talents, with contributions. And so we wanted to tell their story. With Helen Mar Kimball, we go into, she lost her first 3 children as infants. She experienced different things we might describe today as episodes of depression and insomnia, horrible chronic illness. She had a son who committed suicide. She had a daughter who married a non-member and wrestled through all that. Her one son who became a member of the Quorum of the 12 at one point was taking a different path. And she told her story. She recorded journals. She was a prolific writer. She was very passionate about defending the Restoration. How did she get to that point? She was a woman who actually struggled with plural marriage. She didn't just initially accept it. And so we said, let's tell their story. Let's let their voices be heard. Well, when you go to Todd Compton or a progressive version of Helen Mar Kimball's story, they look at her as a little bit crazy, locked into this psychic environment of early Mormonism. But if you actually then let her voice be told and say, well, let's let her speak for herself and actually kind of compare, well, okay, she's saying she's having experiences, spiritual experiences similar to prophets in the Book of Mormon. And you need to decide, is the Book of Mormon a fiction? Is it the result of a psychic environment, or is that true? And again, that comes to each person. They're going to have to decide. But yes, it's something that whole element of spiritual experiences, it's definitely mocked, it's definitely trivialized, and it's definitely downplayed when it comes to this whole rewriting of progressive history.
Now, you were originally going to talk about Leonard Arrington, and I think you have a couple more things to say there. We'll certainly give you some more time because I've been kind of cutting into the Q&A.
No, this is good. I want to talk about what people want to talk about. They can get the books too.
Yeah, right. Get the book, and we'll send out links and stuff for that as well for you. So it seems to me that we've had this progressive migration of the Mormon experience, right, since the time of Joseph. And it's I mean, I agree that, I mean, I think you're going to make a great argument for Leonard Arrington and the kind of boo hiss thing, but even way before him, and that it's this, there seems to be this constant pressure to kind of modernize and do away with the spiritual and embrace the academic, embrace this kind of secularism. And it goes back almost to the foundation. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the very beginning. It probably goes back even to the battle in the pre-mortal life, right? When you come to what you bring out is a great point. So there's always been this attempt to tell different versions of history. So I guess when we talk about what this rewriting of Latter-day Saint history, there was a shift that occurred in the 1900s where it was, for the most part, most members of the church, even a majority kind of the historians and the scholars, there was kind of this consensus around this dominant narrative. And it was, okay, these other stories by these the anti-Mormons are out there telling their own story. We've got these critics out there. But in the 1900s, you tied it to this whole, really this search and this desire for academic acceptance. And that was a battle that was actually had at church headquarters, discussions between Ezra Taft Benson, Leonard Arrington, who was the church historian at the time in the 1980s. And they were discussing that. You had people like Bruce McConkie, who said, I don't really care if the world accepts us. And others who said, no, we need to be accepted at all of the top universities. And then people like Ezra Taft Benson would come in and say, well, what really matters is God's perspective of history, and you can't tell history accurately without God's hand in it. And there was actually a conversation that happened. So just to explain, obviously, you know who Leonard Arrington is. Some of the people on here might, but Leonard Arrington was the church historian around the 1970s, 1980s time period. And he grew up in a member family home in Idaho, but he took a shift of a change of direction when he went to college. So his father asked him to go on a mission, even offered to pay for it during the Great Depression. And Leonard said, no, I'm going to college. And while in college, he hits Darwinian evolution. He hits more kind of the progressive way of thinking, looking at the scriptures. And he didn't have a foundation in the scriptures. He didn't really he wasn't really drawn to them. He read the Book of Mormon once when he was 13, and then never again the rest of his life all the way through. So he kind of embraces more the progressive viewpoint. I think he said the first president of the United States he ever voted for was FDR, and he was very proud of that. So he's coming from this perspective. He becomes the church historian. So of course he's going to look at the church history done by someone like Joseph Fielding Smith, who is coming from a very different perspective, and say, we've got to change the history. And so what we saw happen is we saw really this organized effort, not only to rewrite the history, but to train a new generation of historians and scholars to change the history from the inside. So while maybe from the outside there was this discussion and this debate going on, what we saw through the 1900s, and then it's a huge movement today. In fact, I would say the progressive voice dominates when it comes to scholarship right now. To say, hey, we don't want that traditionalist viewpoint. We want more of a progressive viewpoint. We want the story that's told in Rough Stone Rolling that Joseph Smith he's basically a bumbling idiot. If I can use more of a casual words here.
Yeah. We're a homeschool family, and for us to hear, oh, Joseph Smith's this bumbling idiot because he didn't have any formalized education. If you meet my kids, they're like scholars, homeschooling and being taught, through the Bible and through the best books that are available is a wonderful way to educate. And, yes, I acknowledge that Joseph was not a great speller, but nobody was in the 1830s. Yeah. I mean, some were, but that his thought processes, I'm kind of taking over a second, I apologize. But if we remove Joseph Smith from his prophetic role, from his religious role, and just observe him as an author, he was a genius, a civic reformer for prisons. He was way ahead of his time. He, as a city planner, huge advancements. I mean, Joseph Smith was really one of the great influencers of our day, but the modern world wants to say, oh, he was just this, bumbling backwoods idiot using peepstones and running around with a divining rod. That is just not. It's an offensive kind of a way of approaching things from my perspective.
Sure. And yeah, and I want to take that just one step further, just to correctly, hopefully correctly represent Rough Stone Rolling. They would meet you on the ground of saying, yes, he was brilliant. But the question is, where you really differ, especially from the progressive scholars, is saying, who was Joseph Smith in his personal character? So was Joseph Smith someone who was angry, who lashed back, who had a lot of pride, who was arrogant, who was basically suffered from treasure-seeking greed when he was younger, didn't handle polygamy right, possibly had some issues along the lines of adultery, right? So this personal character, because they separate character from achievement, right? So they, in their opinion, we go into this in Faith Crisis too, because that was a perspective that Leonard Arrington had. The whole controversy with the Bill Clinton affairs coming out and all of those scandals, he was separating. He's like, well, Bill Clinton can still be a good president even though in his private life, he's just not really the best of guys, instead of understanding that actually your character influences your work. And so there's this movement right now that we want to say, Joseph Smith had visions and angels, but in his personal life, he wasn't that great of a guy. No, Joseph Smith was great because he was good. His character was linked. And then not only that, but also this idea that when Joseph Smith restores principles such as the law of consecration, he tries to institute the United Order. When he teaches about plural marriage, when he does the Joseph Smith translation, was that revelation from God? Or was Joseph Smith looking around in his culture and borrowing ideas and then just kind of putting it together in with his own genius brain, kind of this church? Well, that makes it very convenient for us today to say, well, Joseph Smith had some great ideas when it came to maybe even the Book of Mormon. It's great inspired fiction, as some people say, or maybe it is history. Great. But you know what? When it came to Joseph Smith's opinions on women, he was just really chauvinist and a product of his time. He didn't know what he was talking about. And that's where it comes into this. I was just watching a movie that was produced recently by members who, for the most part, are probably well-meaning, but the portrayal of Joseph Smith completely misses, because we're moving into this viewpoint of, yeah, that Joseph Smith guy had some good ideas, had some not so great ideas. Let's pick and choose what we want. Instead, if you really understand who Joseph Smith was, if you understand who he was from a perspective of prophecy, when you understand his role in the marvelous work and a wonder, when you understand he is tied to the Messiah ben Joseph prophecies, and you understand, you read his patriarchal blessings, you understand his mission and who he was as a man of character. If you can come to understand that Joseph Smith truly was who we taught, this pedestal, we were talking to one historian that I won't mention their name, but they were talking to us, and they basically said, guys, your mission is different than ours. Ours is all of the manuals and kind of the past history of the church put Joseph Smith on this pedestal. Our goal, our mission is to take Joseph Smith off that pedestal. And the danger of that is the same thing with the founding fathers. We have seen this pattern play out. You take out the character, when you change the history and you take down, you topple the icons, you take down the heroes and you defame them with inaccurate history. I don't have a problem with telling history how it is. If Joseph Smith had serious problems, we need to be upfront about it. The problem is, I don't believe this is true and accurate history, and I believe that can be demonstrated. But the problem is, once you destroy Joseph Smith's character, that influences and leads consequences to how we view his work and how we view his teachings. And you really notice it today. Joseph Smith is not, his teachings are not well known. They're not appreciated. Even among the general membership, we talk about Joseph Smith, but we don't actually know what he taught. We don't really care because there is this new culture coming in that.
Yeah, I gotta join on that. Sorry to interrupt you.
No,
You're
you're
so
good.
awesome.
I
But-
tend to just
but-
go. So you just have to
No,
stop me.
I just have to amen with you. And you know, a couple of years ago, there's two things I want to bring up. A couple of years ago, I dove into the record. You and I have had a couple of correspondences, and I'm so great to get to know you in this format. It's great. But I dove into the best I could, not having the resources that you had available, to just understand what did Joseph taught. And hundreds of, I wrote a list of hundreds of unique, powerful, important teachings of Joseph Smith that are entirely lost to the general membership today.
Yeah.
And it's so horribly sad. And you know, it's sad for me. And I'll get just one example, and it comes from E. Houghton Cook, right? And so if we look at Joseph Smith's cosmology, the earliest reference we have to the existence of humans is when Joseph referred to us as intelligences being acted upon and tormented by some other intelligence, right? And are you familiar with this? We're in the same place? Yeah, because I see you nodding. Okay. And then if we go, well, that is the oldest thread in the timeline I could find. Maybe you have something older, but as intelligences, at some point we were being acted upon and tormented by some other intelligence or something. And the Elohim agreed to organize us into some way, into some more advanced process. I'm just using whatever words I can come up with, right?
Yeah.
But if we use that alone as a way of looking at the plan of salvation, the plan of salvation is meant to protect us, to allow us to mature out of this apparently eternal battle between torment and freedom and being usurped and being overridden by all kinds of intelligent forces. You follow me so far?
Yeah.
And that's just, we simplify down to, well, we gain a body and we have to be tested. But when Joseph's cosmology is so much broader than that. And when we simplify, we miss. And so that's one thing. Do you have any thoughts about that? Or
Joseph Smith is the only one who can answer the question of evil. All of these debates, endless debates, you can go watch on YouTube, and people are discussing the question of evil and trying to understand, why does the atonement work the way that it does? Joseph Smith is the only one who answers that question. But again, if we're approaching Joseph Smith as he's not that great of a guy, who knows how much of this is actually revealed versus not, it leads to apathy, and it's apathy that we're legitimately seeing in our culture. And even more than that, Richard Bushman has a quote where he says, you know, we've always kind of been sensitive on this idea that Joseph Smith was into the kind of the treasure digging and things like that. And he says, but you know what, like, all sorts of Christians in Joseph Smith's day were involved in it. It was not a big deal. Well, the problem is, one, serious Christians in any age of time have not thought that was not a big deal. But the problem is, you have actually Christians today who will say, they'll say, wait, this is who Joseph Smith is? You're trying to tell me this is who Joseph Smith is? No way. I have seen very brilliant, good Christians, evangelicals and others who I have thought I would love to share with them the gospel, and they possibly could be open to it, but actually their mind was actually soured by the progressive narrative. I think my screen had a problem.
I see Richard Bushman's new information.
Okay.
There we go.
Can you see the little meme here? Okay, perfect. Yeah. There is this,
let me measure your time for you. Would you feel comfortable sharing a LDS style testimony at the end?
Absolutely.
You've been sharing your testimony the whole time period, but I like to hear it in that way. And then I wanted to also address one of the things, and by the way, the off-screen conversation is great and supportive and positive, and I'm feeding you whatever questions come up. One thing about Joseph Smith's visions, there's how many different versions that you know of?
The first vision, or
yeah,
which?
The first vision.
Yeah. There's 9 for sure, but I know that there's some others.
Okay.
That,
So I want to comment about
yeah.
that. And just because it's relevant to this conversation.
Okay.
But
that one is so easy. The first vision is awesome.
So I just want to share something to the audience, and that, and we're not here to boast, we're not here to brag, and we don't want to share our pearls, but we also have promises that in the last days, some people are going to dream dreams and other people have visions, right? That's a promise. We're supposed to experience that. And in the visions that I've had, and there have been several, I've noticed that I'll have a vision, it'll last a few minutes, I'll have a new understanding from it, but then I'll continue to ponder and pray and think about it. And as I ponder that vision, I can go back into the same spot and more is revealed. And people will say, oh, do you mean you discovered something else that was already? No. It means that the vision itself, as we ponder on visions that we have, for many of us, and I've kind of have a group that I'm not like in a cult or something, but people I talk to who have visions, we tend to have the same experience. And that is that you have a vision, it has some meaning. And then as you ponder and pray about it, it becomes a conduit to further and newer understanding. And so to me, Joseph Smith's version his first vision is duh. Yeah, he learned along the way. That's my experience. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you have Joseph Smith speaking to different audiences at different times. You have to understand, I think, when Joseph Smith writes the official account that's in Joseph Smith history, this is him now saying, okay, I'm kind of coming out here publicly and I'm going to share this. That's vulnerable to do. That takes a lot of inspiration to know what to share, how to share it. You're basically putting yourself out there to the world. So different audiences, different times, different reasons for giving it. Absolutely what you just commented on, how the Lord continues. If someone stays righteous, the more mature they get and the closer they come to the Lord, the more they understand about spiritual experiences that they even had in the past, right? And so that's one of the reasons where maybe we're going to disagree with a progressive that says you can only, if someone has in church history, we're only going to accounts that were written down like within 5 years of when it happened. And what they don't understand is, no, if you're someone who's had spiritual experiences, the more righteous you become, the more you progress, the more you endure to the end, the more you mature, over time, God is going to teach you more and more and more. And so actually your perspective on that experience 30 years down the road will probably be more accurate than the day after you have the experience. There's just, so I think you see all of that tied into the first vision accounts, but I just want to note one thing, that when you actually go into the first vision lasted for hours. We do not have even the smallest fraction of an understanding of what happened.
Wow.
And so you have to understand too, what parts of the vision is Joseph Smith talking about? Do you really think the Father was there the whole time? I don't think so. You're probably having a lot of different angels are coming. He's being taught different things. A lot of things are happening. And so him sharing different parts doesn't mean that's in conflict. He's just sharing different portions. So I would say that when you actually go into the first vision accounts, and that takes sitting down to do, but when you actually analyze them, they do not contradict at all. It's not a problem. In fact, it's one of the most faith promoting, I think, and funnest of all these aspects of tough issues, to be honest.